The morning sun barely peeked over the city skyline as she pedaled her old bicycle, the basket rattling with every bump on the cracked sidewalk. Her heart raced faster than the wheels beneath her, carrying not just herself, but the weight of her brother's fight against cancer. Every turn of the pedals whispered hope. This job interview wasn't just a chance, it was survival. This was more than just another day. It was the beginning of her own emotional story.
Hello, I'm going to tell you this incredible story. Remember that to receive new stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notification bell. Let's get to the rest of the story.
And little did she know, fate had a detour waiting just around the corner. In a flash, a sharp swerve, and a gasp, she collided with a man stepping off the curb. The impact jolted both of them, sending her tumbling, groceries scattering, dreams momentarily slipping away. Panicked, she scrambled to help him, voice trembling as she apologized over and over, explaining her urgent situation between hurried breaths. This small moment, seemingly random, was the first ripple of a touching story about to unfold. Strangely, he didn't yell. Instead, he looked at her with an unreadable expression. Clutching the bent handlebars of her beloved bicycle, she blinked back tears, torn between checking if he was hurt and sprinting toward her dreams. Her brother's pale face flashed in her mind, a silent reminder of why she couldn't afford to stop. It was in that chaotic, breathless moment that something invisible tethered them together, the beginning of a real story neither of them could have anticipated. Even the universe, it seemed, was conspiring in ways she couldn't yet understand. The man, brushing off dust from his coat, studied her with a slow, thoughtful gaze. She thought he would scream or call the police, but instead, he knelt down to help gather her scattered things. There was a softness about him, an unexpected patience that didn't match the bustling city crowd around them. As she babbled nervously about needing to reach a life-changing interview, he simply nodded. Without realizing it, this messy encounter was already stitching the first lines of an emotional story into both their lives. Her bike, however, was beyond salvation. The front wheel spun helplessly, a symbol of shattered plans. Panic clawed at her chest. How could she possibly make it on time now? She clutched the broken frame, trying to will it back to life, but it was useless. That's when the man, the stranger she thought she had wronged, pulled out his phone and offered something she never expected. Sometimes in touching stories, help comes from the most surprising places. He called her an Uber without hesitation, brushing off her frantic protest that she had no way to repay him. His calmness contrasted sharply with her rising fear, grounding her even if only for a second. As she climbed into the waiting car, she cast one last apologetic glance at him, memorizing the kindness etched into his face. The real story they were about to create was still hidden under layers of everyday chaos. And yet, something told her, somehow, their paths weren't finished crossing. As the Uber pulled away, she stared out the window, heart pounding, whispering silent promises to her brother, to herself. She vowed that no matter how today unfolded, she would fight for this dream, for both of them. Somewhere behind her, the man stood watching, a peculiar smile touching his lips. In every emotional story worth telling, there's a moment that feels almost too strange to be real. And this was only the beginning of a journey neither could predict, leading straight into an unexpected impression. As he stood there, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket, the man found himself oddly affected by the encounter. In a city where people rushed past each other like ghosts, her raw honesty felt like a breath of fresh air. It wasn't just the apology or the panic in her voice. It was the fire in her eyes, the desperation that spoke louder than words. This wasn't just another morning. It was the start of an emotional story that would pull him deeper than he ever intended. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want it to end. Rather than fuming over the accident, he saw her struggle and made a decision almost without thinking. Pulling out his phone, he called her an Uber, overriding her nervous refusals with a gentle smile. Helping her felt like the most natural thing in the world, even as cars honked impatiently around them. Sometimes, touching stories begin not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet kindnesses that ripple outward in ways no one can predict. As she disappeared down the busy street, he realized he was still smiling. There was something magnetic about her, not in the polished way he was used to at boardrooms and corporate dinners. It was messy, real, and profoundly human, as if she carried the entire emotional story of her life right there in her frantic movements and tearful gratitude. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for someone she loved. That kind of spirit was rare, and rarer still was the way it stayed with him, even after she was gone. Driving back to his office, he couldn't shake her from his thoughts. In a world obsessed with resumes and polished images, her authenticity was disarming. It reminded him of the real story behind every powerful journey. The grit, the fear, the desperate hope that fuels dreams when nothing else can. He thought about the hundreds of candidates he would interview that day, all carefully rehearsed and manicured, and knew none would leave an impression like she had in 5 chaotic minutes. By the time he reached his building, the idea had already taken root in his mind. He needed people like her, people whose emotional story wasn't edited for appearances, but lived boldly in every breath. Without even knowing her name, he decided he would watch for her. Destiny, he thought with a chuckle, sometimes were the strangest disguises, like a broken bicycle and a bleeding heart wrapped up in one. The lobby buzzed with early morning energy as he entered, people shuffling papers and adjusting ties, polishing their smiles. He barely noticed them. His mind was a reel of her frantic apology, her stubborn insistence on fixing the bike, her whispered confession about her brother's illness. The kind of real story you can't fake, no matter how good you're acting. Somewhere deep down, he knew today wasn't going to follow the neat little schedule his secretary had carefully planned. Stepping into the elevator, he found himself hoping, irrationally, childishly, that maybe, just maybe, she would be among the sea of applicants waiting upstairs. After all, in the best touching stories, fate has a way of circling back when we least expect. And if destiny had already knocked him off his feet once today, who was to say it was finished yet? When he stepped in the glass-walled conference room, the buzz of nervous candidates filled the air. Sharp suits, stiff smiles, rehearsed small talk. Everything looked exactly as expected. And then, like a splash of color on a gray canvas, he saw her. She sat quietly, hands gripping her folder so tightly the papers inside trembled. In that moment, he knew he was standing at the crossroads of another emotional story about to unfold right before his eyes. Without letting his expression change, he whispered to his secretary, requesting to sit in on her interview. She raised an eyebrow, but obeyed, sensing something unusual stirring beneath his polished exterior. The CEO, a man whose schedule was carved in stone, had just made a spontaneous decision, and it wasn't about profit margins. Touching stories often slip through the cracks of daily life, unnoticed, but this one demanded his full attention. The real story he was about to witness had already hooked his heart. When her name was finally called, she rose so quickly that her chair nearly toppled backward. Gathering herself, she entered the room like a gust of fresh wind, filling the sterile air with something no one could define but everyone could feel. Her smile, nervous but genuine, was a rare treasure in a world of polished facades. Sometimes an emotional story doesn't need grand speeches. It simply walks into a room and changes the temperature. The usual formalities began, where she studied, where she worked before, but her answers carried a different kind of weight. She spoke of resilience, of learning to adapt, of hope burning even when things seemed lost. She wasn't selling herself. She was sharing herself, her voice trembling slightly when she mentioned her brother's fight. In that moment, the real story wasn't about qualifications. It was about humanity, raw and breathtaking. Interviewers who usually wore boredom like a second skin now leaned forward, captivated. Even the stern HR director found herself smiling, tapping her pen against the clipboard with a strange, rhythmic hopefulness. It wasn't just what the young woman said. It was the fierce life pouring out of her words, weaving a touching story none of them would forget. Against all odds, she was breathing life into a room designed to drain it. He watched from the corner, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since he built his first company from scratch. There, before his eyes, was proof that an emotional story can shatter walls faster than any strategic plan. She wasn't perfect, and that was exactly what made her unforgettable. She carried her battle scars with pride, and somehow, they looked like medals rather than flaws. As she finished answering a final question, the room held its breath for a moment, caught in the invisible web she had spun. She smiled shyly, clutching her folder as if it were a shield, unaware of the profound impact she had just made. In touching stories, heroes often rise without knowing they're being watched. And as the CEO exchanged a glance with his secretary, the next chapter of this real story was already writing itself. One that would take them far beyond the cold walls of a conference room. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He had come to the interview out of curiosity, out of a strange pull he couldn't quite explain. But now, sitting across the room and watching her nervously twirl a strand of hair, he felt something shift deep inside. This wasn't just admiration for her resilience. It was something far more dangerous, far more thrilling. Sometimes, an emotional story sneaks up on you when you're busy chasing logic. That evening, unable to wrestle the feeling away, he sent her an unexpected message through the HR department. An invitation, casual, respectful, to dinner, framed as a chance to discuss further opportunities. She almost didn't accept, suspicious at first, but the sincerity in his tone softened her. After all, touching stories often begin with a leap of faith, and her heart, battered but brave, whispered that she should take the chance. And so, trembling slightly, she agreed. They met at a quiet bistro tucked away from the city's noise, where laughter floated like music from the small tables. She arrived in a simple dress and nervous energy, while he showed up stripped of the CEO armor. No tailored suit, just a man who wanted to know her better. Overshared plates and shy smiles, the emotional story between them started weaving itself, thread by invisible thread, pulling them closer with every word. What struck her most wasn't his wealth or his success. It was the way he listened. Really listened, like every broken piece of her mattered. And what struck him wasn't her beauty, although she had plenty of that. It was her soul, raw and fierce and achingly real. In a world full of polished lies, the real story was so rare that once you found it, you'd be a fool to let it go. And neither of them wanted to be fools tonight. They talked about dreams. Hers for her brother's recovery, his for creating something meaningful beyond boardrooms and profit margins. They shared fears, laughter, childhood memories, the quiet things that make up touching stories too precious for public display. Somewhere between dessert and midnight, the city around them faded into a soft, irrelevant blur. All that remained was the space between two hearts learning how to beat together. When they said goodbye that night, something unspoken hovered in the air, stretching the moment like warm taffy. It wasn't a grand declaration or a cinematic kiss. It was a simple squeeze of hands, a lingering glance, a silent promise. Every emotional story has its turning point, and theirs had just quietly happened under the glow of streetlights and shared vulnerability. They walked away in opposite directions, but both carried the same seed blooming quietly inside. And as the days that followed melted into long conversations, stolen glances, and growing trust, it became clear this wasn't a fleeting moment. This was a real story in the making, one that neither time nor tragedy could easily erase. Because even in the brightest, touching stories, shadows eventually creep in, and soon, life would test everything they had begun to build together. Life, with its strange sense of timing, doesn't always wait for happiness to settle in before striking. Just when their emotional story was finding its rhythm, a devastating phone call shattered their fragile world. Her brother's fight, the one that had fueled her every breath, ended quietly in the sterile light of a hospital room. No matter how prepared you think you are, grief crashes in like a rogue wave. In every touching story, there's a moment when the heart cracks open and the real story begins again, this time heavier. She broke in ways he couldn't fix, and it tore him apart. She withdrew, folding into herself like a wounded bird, carrying guilt like a second skin. He stayed close, but careful, understanding that true love isn't about rushing in with solutions. It's about sitting quietly beside someone in their darkest hour. Emotional story after emotional story taught him that healing isn't a race. It's a slow, painful rebuild, brick by broken brick. Days blurred into nights, grief painting everything in muted colors. And yet, amidst the ashes of what was lost, a stubborn little flame refused to die inside her. One afternoon, while sitting under the hospital's weeping willow tree, she whispered through tears, "It's too late for him, but it's not too late for others." That simple, broken sentence cracked something open inside both of them. The real story they were about to write would be born not from success, but from sorrow. They spent long nights dreaming, planning, scribbling ideas onto napkins and notepads. What if they could create a place where no family had to beg, borrow, or go bankrupt for basic cancer care? What if her brothers fight, and their shared pain could become the foundation of hope for others? Touching stories aren't about avoiding pain. They're about transforming it into something bigger than yourself. And together, they decided that was exactly what they would do. Pooling their resources, his wealth, her relentless spirit, they began drafting plans for a nonprofit cancer treatment center. It wouldn't be a cold, clinical place. It would be a sanctuary, warm and human, where emotional story after emotional story could find a fighting chance. Early detection, subsidized treatments, emotional support. They wanted to tackle the battle on every front. Their grief had given them clarity, and now their love gave them fuel. Of course, people doubted them. Skeptics whispered that billionaires don't stay committed to messy causes, that touching stories make nice headlines but terrible business models. They didn't listen. The pain they carried wasn't for show, and neither was their determination. In every brick they laid, every life they touched, they wove a real story, one that honored the boy who had quietly fought until he couldn't anymore, one that promised others a better chance at life. And as the blueprints turned into walls and the walls filled with hope, they realized something beautiful. Healing others was healing them too. Grief, once an unbearable weight, became a bridge connecting them to something larger than themselves. Emotional stories, they learned, don't end with loss. They evolve. And soon, their small sanctuary would become a beacon far bigger than either of them had ever imagined. The grand opening of their center didn't come with confetti or spotlights. Instead, it came with trembling hands cutting a simple ribbon and eyes brimming with quiet tears. Patients began arriving, each carrying their own emotional story, each step into the building heavy with unspoken fear and desperate hope. It didn't take long for the center to become more than just walls and treatment rooms. It became a living, breathing testament that touching stories could rebuild broken worlds. Families who had once been turned away elsewhere now found open doors and open arms. Early detection programs saved lives that would have otherwise slipped through the cracks. Subsidized treatments allowed parents to stay hopeful instead of haunted by bills. Every hallway echoed with laughter, tears, prayers, and gratitude. The messy symphony of real story after real story unfolding in real time. The center became a place where pain met compassion halfway. They were there every day, not as untouchable founders, but as human beings still stitched together by their own emotional story. She would sit beside worried mothers during consultations. He would read to children hooked up to IVs. They weren't saviors. They were fellow travelers, broken in their own ways, offering pieces of their journey to help others survive theirs. In touching stories, the true heroes are often the ones who simply refuse to walk away. Their nonprofit grew faster than they ever imagined, fueled by partnerships with companies who believed in the cause. Volunteers flooded in, donors wrote checks, and the local news shared their mission like wildfire. But behind every headline and every donation was a simple truth. The center wasn't built on money. It was built on grief, love, and an unbreakable belief that real story, when embraced, can change everything. And every patient who walked out stronger became part of that living legacy. Despite the success, they never let go of why it all began. Her brother's photo hung in the lobby, a quiet reminder that every day was a gift snatched back from the jaws of loss. Emotional stories like theirs don't erase pain. They weave it into something new, something stronger. They had taken the ugliest moment of their lives and planted seeds that blossomed in a hope for others. And somehow, healing others helped heal the pieces of themselves that grief had shattered. Late at night, when the world grew still, they would walk the halls hand in hand, peeking into rooms where miracles were quietly happening. A father hugging his daughter after remission, a boy laughing as nurses sang him through chemotherapy. Touching stories played out under the soft glow of bedside lamps, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Those moments stitched new chapters into their real story, reminding them that love, even born from pain, could outlast anything. And as they looked toward the future, dreams expanded again. More centers in more cities, better technology, greater outreach. Their mission wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Because when an emotional story is built on something as fierce and unbreakable as love and loss, its echoes don't fade. They grow louder, reaching hearts far beyond what the first broken bicycle, the first chaotic meeting, could have ever imagined. Have you ever had a moment that felt like a complete disaster, only to realize later it was the beginning of something extraordinary? Bicycle, what if the worst day of your life was actually the doorway to the best chapter you've ever lived? I'd love to hear your emotional story, the real story that changed everything for you, down in the comments. Your touching stories might inspire someone who's still waiting for their miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps more people find real stories like this one. And hey, why not subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications? That way, you'll never miss another emotional story that might just change your perspective forever. Your next moment of destiny could be just one story away. Glowing Star.